Tracy almost dropped the tray when she saw the elderly couple counting their coins. "We can share the one bowl, Harold," the woman whispered. "It's enough for both of us." Tracy looked at the $42 in her apron, her rent money, and made a choice. What she didn't know was that the frail couple she was about to save from embarrassment were the parents of Juno Choi, the most ruthless Korean mafia boss in the city. The fluorescent lights of the diner flickered over the empty booths of late-night shifts. The smell of burnt coffee and floor wax hung heavy in the air. Tracy F. Hall adjusted her apron, her feet throbbing inside her worn-out sneakers. At 23, Tracy was a master of the double shift, working until her eyes burned just to keep her small apartment. Tonight was particularly quiet. The city was cold, the customers were few, and the tips were even fewer. In her pocket sat exactly $42. It was the difference between having a roof over her head and facing the street on Monday morning. Then, she saw them. Mr. and Mrs. Jong sat in the corner, their silver hair catching the dim light. They looked out of place, too quiet, too gentle for this part of town. The old man traced the lines of the menu with a trembling finger, while his wife leaned in, clutching a tiny change purse. Tracy wasn't trying to eavesdrop. But in the silence of the diner, their whispers felt like thunder. "Maybe we just get the tea," Mrs. Jong murmured softly. "We shouldn't spend what we don't have." Tracy felt a sharp ache in her chest. She recognized that tone instantly. It was the careful, dignified voice of someone pretending they weren't starving. It was the same voice she used when she told her mother she'd already eaten so there would be more for her. Tracy looked at the cashier, then back at her $42. She knew she was risking her own safety. But in that moment, Tracy made a decision that would rewrite her destiny forever. The diner was an island of fluorescent light in the middle of a cold, indifferent night. Tracy leaned against the counter, the linoleum cold beneath her palms as she watched the steam rise from a forgotten cup of coffee. Her feet felt like lead, a dull ache that started in her heels and radiated up to her lower back. She checked the clock, 11:45 p.m. Only 15 minutes left of a 14-hour day. She reached into her apron, her fingers brushing the small roll of cash, exactly $42. It was a meager shield against the eviction notice sitting on her kitchen table, but it was all she had. She was about to head to the back to grab a mop when the bell above the door chimed. A gust of biting wind followed an elderly couple into the warmth. They moved slowly, their movements synchronized by decades of walking side by side. The man, Mr. Jong, wore a dark jacket that had seen better days, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. Beside him, Mrs. Jong clutched a beige coat tightly to her chest, her silver hair perfectly neat despite the wind. Tracy watched them as they navigated to the farthest corner booth. They didn't look like the usual late-night crowd, the rowdy teenagers or the weary truckers. There was a profound, quiet dignity in their silence. They sat down with a grace that felt out of place amidst the chipped mugs and greasy menus. As Tracy approached with 2 glasses of water, she noticed the way Mr. Jong's hands trembled slightly as he smoothed out the paper placemat. "Good evening," Tracy said, her voice naturally softening. "Can I start you off with some coffee? Or maybe a hot tea?" Mrs. Jong looked up, her expression gentle but weary. "Just water for now, thank you, dear," she replied. Her voice was thin, like parchment paper, but held a warmth that reminded Tracy of her own grandmother. Tracy lingered for a moment, ostensibly to wipe down the adjacent table, but her eyes kept drifting back to them. They weren't looking at the steak specials or the deluxe platters. Instead, they were huddled over a single menu, their heads close together. Mr. Jong pulled a small, frayed change purse from his pocket and emptied it onto the table. Tracy's heart sank as she watched him meticulously count out a small pile of nickels and dimes. The weariness in their eyes wasn't just from the late hour, it was the look of people who had spent a lifetime giving and were now left with very little for themselves. They looked humble, almost fragile, yet they held themselves with a calm that commanded respect. In that quiet corner of the diner, they seemed like a fading memory of a gentler world. Tracy felt a familiar tightening in her chest. The same ache she felt when she saw her mother skip dinner to make sure there was enough for the kids. She knew that look. And she knew she couldn't just walk away. Tracy kept her distance, busy with the ritual of refilling salt shakers, but her attention remained anchored to the far corner booth. She watched as Mr. Zhang's weathered fingers traced the prices on the laminated menu, his brow furrowed in a silent, mathematical struggle. Beside him, Mrs. Zhang sat with her hands folded neatly on the table, a small, courageous smile pinned to her face as if trying to reassure her husband that the cold and the hunger didn't matter as long as they were together. Finally, Mr. Zhang closed the menu with a soft, decisive thud. He looked up, catching Tracy's eye, and raised a hand just enough to signal he was ready. Tracy approached, her notepad ready, though her heart felt heavy with a premonition she couldn't shake. "Have you decided on something special tonight?" she asked, her voice light and professional, trying to mask the empathy that was already tightening her throat. Mr. Zhang cleared his throat, his eyes momentarily dropping to the table. "We will have the beef barley soup," he said quietly. "Just one bowl. And 2 spoons, please." Tracy hesitated, her pen hovering over the paper. "The soup is quite small tonight," she said gently, offering an opening. "We have a special on the chicken pot pie, or I could bring you a side of bread at no charge." Mrs. Zhang reached out, her hand resting briefly on her husband's arm. "One soup is plenty, dear," she said, her voice steady but thin. "We aren't very hungry tonight. The walk was long, and we just need something to warm us up." As Tracy turned toward the kitchen, she heard the soft clink of coins. She glanced back and saw Mr. Zhang meticulously arranging a small pile of nickels and dimes on the table, counting them twice, his lips moving in a silent tally. They weren't just not very hungry. They were measuring their survival in cents. The sight of those 2 spoons resting side by side next to a single, steaming bowl of soup a few minutes later was more than Tracy could bear. It was the careful voice of her own mother, the one that claimed she had eaten at work so Tracy could have the last piece of chicken. It was the dignity of the proud poor, people who would rather share a single serving than ask for a hand they didn't think would be extended. She looked at the $42 in her pocket, the money that was supposed to keep her own lights on. Then she looked at the 2 elderly people sharing a meal meant for one, their movements slow and full of a quiet, heartbreaking grace. In that moment, the rent money didn't feel like a lifeline anymore, it felt like a responsibility. She knew what she had to do, and she knew she had to do it in a way that wouldn't shatter the fragile dignity they were holding onto so tightly. Tracy walked away from the table, the image of those 2 spoons resting in a single bowl of soup burned into her mind. She felt the weight of the $42 in her pocket, the money that was meant to be her safety net, the thin line between a roof over her head and the cold street. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and conviction. She knew that if she did this, she would have to spend the rest of the week walking to work and skipping meals, but the thought of that elderly couple walking out into the night feeling the sting of poverty was more than she could stomach. She approached the register where Mike, the night manager, was staring blankly at a small television. Tracy didn't give herself time to second guess. She pulled the crumpled bills from her apron, her hands trembling just as Mr. Zhang's had. "Table 4, she whispered, leaning over the counter so her voice wouldn't carry. "The soup and the tea. Put it on my tab. Use this." Mike looked down at the money, then up at Tracy, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Tracy, that's your tip jar. I saw you counting it earlier. You said you were short on rent." "I'll figure the rent out, Mike," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Just, don't let them know. If they ask for the check, tell them it's been taken care of by a promotional thing or an anonymous donor. Anything. Just don't tell them it was me." Mike glanced over Tracy's shoulder at the corner booth, where the Jongs were carefully sharing a spoonful of broth, their movements full of a quiet, heartbreaking grace. He looked back at Tracy, his expression softening from skepticism to a reluctant respect. He knew Tracy's situation. He knew she lived in a neighborhood where $42 was a fortune. "You're a softie, Hall," Mike muttered, but he took the bills and began ringing them through the register. "They're gonna wonder, you know. People like that, they have a way of noticing things." "Then let them wonder," Tracy replied, a small, sad smile touching her lips. "Just let them leave here feeling like the world gave them a break for once." She took a deep breath, smoothing her apron and wiping a stray tear from her cheek before it could fall. She had just given away her survival for the week, but as she looked back at the couple, she felt a strange, light coldness in her chest. She was broke, and she was terrified of what Monday morning would bring, but for the first time in months, she didn't feel like a victim of her circumstances. She felt like someone who had power. She had preserved their dignity, even if she had sacrificed her own security to do it. Tracy turned back to the kitchen to fetch more water, stepping lightly, unaware that the quiet old man in the corner had been watching the exchange at the register with eyes that were far sharper than they appeared. The bell above the diner door gave a lonely chime as Tracy stepped out into the biting night air. The warmth of the kitchen was gone in an instant, replaced by a wind that cut through her thin uniform like a blade. She pulled her coat tighter, but it offered little protection against the damp chill of the city. As she began the long walk home, a walk she usually took the bus for, the weight of her decision finally settled in her chest, heavy and cold. Each footstep on the cracked pavement seemed to echo the number, 42. That was the price of her rent gap. That was the price of two elderly strangers' dignity. Now, her pockets were empty, save for a few sticky nickels and a crumpled napkin. She calculated the math again in her head, a desperate, circular logic she couldn't escape. If she worked a triple shift on Saturday, and if the lunch crowd was generous, maybe, just maybe, she could beg her landlord for 3 more days. But Mr. Henderson wasn't a man known for his patience, and the yellow eviction notice was already tucked firmly into her doorframe, a silent threat waiting for her return. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the alleyways. Usually, Tracy walked with her head down, her heart racing at every sudden noise, but tonight she felt a strange sort of numbness. She passed the grocery store, her stomach giving a sharp, hollow growl as she looked at the closed doors. There would be no milk or eggs tomorrow. It would be another day of toast and water. She thought of the Jongs, picturing the way the old man's hands had stopped trembling when the check never arrived. She pictured the small, confused smile on the woman's face as they walked out into the dark, perhaps feeling for a moment that the world wasn't as cruel as they had feared. Was a roof over her head worth more than the light she had seen in their eyes? By the time she reached her apartment building, her breath was coming in white plumes and her toes were numb. The hallway smelled of old cooking oil and damp carpet. She stopped in front of her door, staring at the peeling paint. She had no money, no plan, and no safety net. She was a 23-year-old waitress with nothing but a tired heart and a mounting debt. As she turned the key in the lock, the silence of the apartment felt deafening. This was the darkest hour, the moment where kindness felt like a mistake and the future looked like a dead end. She collapsed onto her bed without taking off her coat, shivering as she wondered if Monday morning would be the day she finally lost everything. She didn't know that miles away, in a mansion shielded by iron gates, her name was already being spoken with a profound, quiet reverence. The sun had barely begun to burn through the morning mist when Tracy pushed through the heavy diner doors for her Saturday shift. Her eyes were bloodshot from a sleepless night spent staring at the eviction notice, and her heart felt like a hollow weight in her chest. She moved through the motions of the morning rush like a ghost, filling coffee cups and wiping down counters with a robotic efficiency, her mind occupied by the terrifying silence of her empty bank account. The shift was halfway over when the atmosphere in the diner suddenly shifted. It didn't start with a sound, but with a shadow. One by one, the customers at the window booths stopped eating, their forks frozen halfway to their mouths. Tracy looked out the front glass and felt a surge of cold adrenaline. 3 massive, jet-black SUVs, their windows tinted to a mirror-like finish, pulled onto the curb with military precision. They didn't just park. They occupied the space, cutting off the sunlight and casting the diner into a sudden, artificial dusk. The engines rumbled with a low, predatory growl that vibrated through the floorboards and up through the soles of Tracy's worn shoes. Before she could process what was happening, the doors of the vehicles swung open. 6 men stepped out simultaneously, all wearing sharp, charcoal-gray suits and earpieces that glinted in the morning light. They moved with a terrifying, coordinated stillness, fanning out to flank the entrance. They weren't the usual local toughs or the neighborhood police. These men carried the unmistakable aura of professional power and lethal discipline. The diner fell into a deafening silence. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the wall clock and the hiss of the grill. Tracy gripped a glass carafe so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her first thought was that something had gone horribly wrong. That the neighborhood was being raided, or that she had unknowingly crossed a line she didn't even know existed. One of the men, taller than the rest with a scar cutting a clean line through his eyebrow, stepped forward and held the door open. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound deference. A hush deeper than the one before fell over the room as a younger man stepped out of the center vehicle. He was dressed in a tailored black overcoat that looked like it cost more than Tracy would earn in a decade. His presence was magnetic and terrifying, his eyes scanning the room with a cold, piercing intelligence. "Where is she?" the man asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the room, vibrating with a dangerous authority. Tracy felt the eyes of every customer and coworker turn toward her. She stood paralyzed behind the counter, the light blue fabric of her uniform damp with sweat. The man's gaze locked onto hers, and for a heartbeat, Tracy forgot how to breathe. She was a waitress who had given away her last $42 to a pair of strangers, and now, the most dangerous man in the city was walking straight toward her. The man in the black overcoat moved with a silent, predatory grace, his presence commanding the air out of the room. The diner patrons sat motionless, their breaths held, as the tall man stopped just inches from the counter where Tracy stood. Up close, his eyes weren't just cold, they were weary, carrying the weight of a world Tracy only saw in the news. He looked at her name tag, then his gaze softened, just a fraction, as it met hers. "You are Tracy F. Hall?" he asked. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. Tracy nodded, her throat so dry she couldn't find her voice. She expected a threat, a demand, or perhaps a warning about a debt she didn't know she owed. Instead, the man reached into his coat and pulled out a small, elegant envelope, placing it on the scarred Formica counter. "My name is Juno Choi," he said, his voice dropping to a tone of quiet respect. "The elderly couple you served 2 nights ago, they are my parents. Mr. and Mrs. Jong." Tracy's mind raced back to the corner booth, to the trembling hands counting nickels and the single bowl of soup. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice a mere whisper. "I just thought they were hungry. I didn't mean to offend them by paying the bill." Juno Choi let out a short, hollow breath that might have been a laugh in another life. "Offend them? My mother told me she hadn't seen such pure dignity in 30 years. My father. He hasn't stopped talking about the waitress who gave up her own rent money so they could finish their tea in peace." He leaned in closer, his dark eyes searching hers. "They were without their security detail because my father is stubborn. He wanted one night to feel like a normal man again, to see if the world was still kind. He found his answer in you. Tracy looked at the men in suits, then back at Juno. The poor couple she had pitied were the architects of the most powerful family in the city. The $42 she had sacrificed was a drop in the ocean compared to the wealth represented by the man standing before her, yet Juno was looking at her as if she were the one holding all the power. "In my world," Juno said, his voice turning cold again as he addressed the room, "kindness is often mistaken for weakness. But my parents taught me that true strength is giving when you have nothing left to give." He turned back to Tracy, pushing the envelope toward her. "You protected their dignity when they chose to be vulnerable. Now, it is my turn to protect yours." Tracy reached out, her fingers brushing the expensive paper of the envelope. The fear that had been her constant companion for months began to recede, replaced by a staggering realization. She hadn't just paid a bill. She had moved the heart of a man who moved the city. As Juno Choi turned to leave, his men falling into formation behind him, Tracy realized her life of double shifts and eviction notices had ended the moment she slid those crumpled bills across the counter. After Juno Choi's motorcade vanished into the city traffic, the diner remained in a stunned, heavy silence. Tracy stood behind the counter, her fingers trembling as she finally opened the thick, cream-colored envelope. She expected a check, perhaps a few $100s to replace what she had given, but as she pulled out the contents, her breath hitched. There was no single check. Instead, there was a stack of official receipts and legal documents, each one stamped with a bold, red "paid in full." The first was a confirmation from her landlord, Mr. Henderson. Her overdue rent, the late fees, and even the next 6 months of payments had been settled in a single wire transfer. The eviction notice that had felt like a noose around her neck was now nothing more than a scrap of paper. Below that was a statement from the local hospital where her mother had undergone surgery the year before. The mountain of medical debt that Tracy had been chipping away at with every double shift. A sum that would have taken her a decade to clear, now showed a balance of 0. A small, handwritten note fell out from between the pages. The script was elegant, written in a steady hand that reflected the quiet dignity of the old man from the corner booth. "Kindness is the only currency that doubles when it is spent. You gave us more than a meal, Tracy. You gave us a reminder that there is still light in the dark. Our debts are settled, yours are now erased." Tracy sank onto a stool, the weight of the world literally lifting from her shoulders. For the first time in years, the crushing pressure in her chest, the constant, low-grade panic of survival, simply evaporated. She didn't have to calculate the cost of a bus ride. She didn't have to wonder if she could afford a gallon of milk on the way home. The careful voice she had shared with the Jongs, the voice of the proud and hungry, was no longer necessary. As she looked out the window at the gray city streets, the sun finally broke through the clouds, catching the gold lettering on the hospital receipt. She realized then that Juno Choi hadn't just repaid a debt, he had dismantled the cage she had been living in. Her $42 had been a sacrifice of everything she had, and in the strange, high-stakes justice of the Choi family, that sacrifice had been met with a transformation. She was no longer a girl drowning in the shadows of Maple Street. She was free. Tracy wiped away a tear, not of exhaustion, but of overwhelming relief, unaware that the envelope held one final surprise, an invitation that would move her even further from the diner's greasy counters and into a world she had only ever seen from the outside. The transformation of Tracy's world did not happen with a single check, but with a quiet, absolute shift in the atmosphere of her neighborhood. The following Monday, when she stepped out of her apartment building, she didn't see the usual shadows lurking in the stairwell or the aggressive stares of the local gangs that had made her walk a daily gauntlet of fear. Instead, 2 men in dark suits stood near a polished black sedan at the curb. They didn't speak, they simply nodded as she passed, a silent signal to the street that the woman from apartment 4B was now under the shadow of the dragon. For the first time in her life, Tracy walked with her shoulders back, the air no longer tasting of cold anxiety. The second surprise arrived in the form of a small, discreet package delivered to her door. Inside was an enrollment packet for the city's most prestigious design academy, the school Tracy had spent years staring at through a computer screen, knowing the tuition was a dream she could never afford. Attached was a student ID card with her photo and a note from Mrs. Zhang. A heart that creates beauty for others deserves the tools to create beauty for herself. As Tracy traded her grease-stained apron for a leather portfolio, she realized that Juno Choi hadn't just given her money, he had given her time. He had bought her the freedom to fail, to learn, and to breathe. She spent her days in sun-drenched studios, her fingers no longer stained with dishwater but with charcoal and ink. At night, she would return home to find that the hallway light had been fixed, the locks on the front door reinforced, and a basket of fresh groceries waiting on her counter. She often thought of the Zhangs, wondering if they knew the magnitude of what they had done. She saw Juno's face occasionally on the news, a man of power and sharp edges, but to her, he was the son of the couple who shared a single bowl of soup. She realized that in this new life, her reckless empathy wasn't a flaw that threatened her survival, it was the foundation of her new reality. She was no longer a girl running away from poverty, she was a woman running toward a future that had been paid for by a $42 act of grace. The city felt different now, smaller, kinder, and infinitely more accessible. Under the silent, ironclad protection of the Choi family, Tracy F. Hall began to build a life that was no longer defined by what she lacked, but by the boundless potential of what she could finally become. 5 years had passed since the night the fluorescent hum of the diner was the only soundtrack to Tracy's life. Now, the sounds were different, the elegant murmur of an art gallery, the soft clink of champagne flutes, and the rhythmic clicking of cameras. Tracy stood in the center of the room, surrounded by her own textile designs, each fabric telling a story of resilience and hidden strength. She wore a dress of her own making, a deep, midnight blue that shimmered like the city sky she once walked under in fear. As the gala wound down, Tracy found herself standing near a tall window, looking out at the sprawling skyline. The city hadn't changed, but her place in it was unrecognizable. She felt a familiar, gentle presence behind her before a hand rested lightly on her shoulder. She turned to see Mr. and Mrs. Zhang, looking exactly as she remembered them, though their coats were finer and their eyes were bright with a shared secret. "You have built something beautiful, Tracy," Mr. Zhang said, his voice no longer a whisper of hunger, but a steady resonance of pride. "I only built what you gave me the room to imagine," Tracy replied, her voice thick with an emotion she still struggled to name. She looked past them to see Juno Choi standing near the entrance. He didn't join the conversation, he simply inclined his head in that same silent, respectful bow he had given her years ago in the diner. He was the shadow that allowed her to live in the light, the guardian of a destiny that had been rewritten by a handful of crumpled bills. Tracy reached into her small clutch and felt a single, laminated $42 bill she kept as a talisman. It was a reminder that the world wasn't moved by grand gestures alone, but by the quiet choices made in the dark. She thought of the careful voice she used to have and the girl who was terrified of Monday mornings. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who knew that empathy was the most powerful currency in existence. As the Zhangs moved to join their son, Tracy looked back at the skyline. She realized that her sacrifice hadn't just paid for a bowl of soup or saved her from an eviction, it had bridged two worlds that never should have met. Her life was no longer a struggle for survival, but a testament to a single, radical act of grace. The $42 hadn't just changed her circumstances. It had changed her soul, proving that when you give everything you have to preserve the dignity of another, the universe has a way of returning the favor in ways you could never imagine. Tracy smiled, finally at peace, knowing that her destiny was no longer a matter of luck, but a masterpiece of kindness.